Which real-life serial killer frightened/disturbed you the most? The Axeman of New Orleans basically forced the entire city into playing jazz music so he would spare their lives. Pretty horrific deaths, and nobody was ever charged for the killings. Wasn't there a show on A&E recently that claimed it was most likely the Sicilian Mafia? Axes were the preferred weapon of Sicilian hitmen in the early days of the mob. And they, multiple killers, only targeted Sicilian shop owners who'd borrowed money from the mob. Couldn't say on the show, but yeah, that's a prominent theory surrounding him, or them. Normally though, the murder weapon was something the victim owned, normally a fire axe or a razor. His victims weren't limited to Sicilian shop owners as well, though some were non-immigrants such as Sarah Lawman. I remember this guy wanted to send some letters to the police on a floppy disk, and he asked them if they could trace him if he sent them the disk. The police said that they could not trace him using the disk. He sent them the disk. The police traced him using the disk and made the arrest. For a serial killer known for being intelligent, it really seemed like a stupid way to get caught. He was so arrogant that he didn't believe that the cops would lie to him. It's technically true, the floppy disk itself doesn't keep a record of where it is used. Unfortunately, or I guess, fortunately, they recovered a deleted Microsoft Word document that had metadata from the church computer he used to write the message that showed Rader as the user. Israel Keyes, rapist, serial killer, necrophiliac. He was raised in a militant fundamentalist Christian household, joined the military, then came back to the US and killed at least 11 people all over the country. He went to extraordinary lengths to not be caught by choosing victims at random, killing far from his home. He would hide kill kits and return years later when he was ready to kill someone in that area. It's terrifying how he killed a woman in Alaska, went on vacation with his family to some Caribbean island for a few days. Flew back to Alaska. Took the poor woman's body and sewed her eyes open and had her corpse pose with a newspaper that was a few days old to throw off law enforcement into thinking she was a runaway. Dismembered her. He then used her credit card in different states to show she was on the move. But that was what got him caught. That's one of the least scary trips he took. There was one in 2008. October 24, 2008, Alaska Airlines flight, Anchorage to Seattle. October 25, 2008, Northwest Airlines flight, Seattle to Minneapolis. October 25, 2008, Northwest Airlines flight, Minneapolis to Grand Forks, North Dakota. October 30, 2008, U.S. Airways flight, Phoenix to San Francisco. October 31, 2008, Alaska Airlines flight, San Francisco to Seattle. October 31 to November 5, 2008, vehicle rental, Thrifty, 2008 Pints Cruiser, Washington license plate 443XQQ, drove 626 miles. Seattle, Washington. November 1, 2008, hotel reservation, Sequim Inn, Sequim, Washington. November 2, 2008, Alaska Airlines flight, Seattle to Boston, multi-city trip. November 5, 2008, Alaska Airlines flight, Seattle to Anchorage. Read through that. Look at those dates. And the locations. He flew to North Dakota and then 5 days later showed up in Phoenix to fly to California. 1,770 miles in 5 days isn't huge, but that's 1,770 miles the FBI have now had to search for missing people. The podcast True Crime Bullshit is all about Keyes, and despite him being mocked into the dirt on Alpodal, I still think he's one of the most interesting and terrifying people ever. https://www.fbi.gov/news/stories/new information released in serial killer case. Yeah, what always chilled me about this guy was, he was an average dude who wanted no fame or recognition. He truly was just killing for enjoyment, like making vacations out of it. It made me wonder how many people are like that out there, who haven't been caught. Israel Keyes only got caught because he got careless at the end. I imagine there are still serial killers out there. They just got smarter about it. No killing cute white girls, no sending taunting letters to the media. Just kill random prostitutes and homeless people and go on your way. Plus a pretty sizable proportion of murders never get solved, so it's not that unusual in general. Ah yes, he was another frightening guy because he breaks almost every convention that people seem to have of serial killers, that they are ugly or deformed. Keyes was a good-looking guy, that they are socially inept, successful in both the military and in business, and that they are victims of terrible mothers/fathers. He had a relatively good upbringing. He was methodical, patient and cunning. If this had been the 50s or so, can't imagine how many victims he would have had, if he would have been caught at all. Dean Corll. I almost puked when reading about the methods of torture he used on little boys. He was such an asshole that his teenage accomplice was the one that killed him, which revealed his 28+ murders to the public. There is a haunting photo of an unidentified victim that was found in his accomplice's property years after they got busted. Nobody has any clue who the kid is, but the image of distress on his face and the toolbox full of torture tools next to him have forever been burned into my mind. One of the saddest stories is one of the boys he picked up was 14 years old and on his way home from the gas station. He was saving up bottle caps for recycling money to take a girl to the movie and he never made it home. Imagine how high on life that kid was. He must have worked so hard to get the money together to take a pretty girl he probably had a crush on for a long time to the movies. He must have been so happy on the walk home. But then he ended up dying a slow and painful death. Shit makes me tear up. Edit: the boy's name was James Stanton Dramala. He was the very last boy that girl killed. Oh yes, the guy in Houston, I think, who grew up relatively wealthy with a candy company. He was another one who was not only a pedophile but brutally tortured his victims. I'm glad that so many of the people responding are particularly disgusted by these sadists because, quite frankly, they deserve the hate. Can't imagine how many people's lives he ruined, even the accomplices who got caught up and seduced in his evil. I believe at least one of them is still alive in prison. And yes, I've seen that picture. Horrific. My mother lived in Houston Heights when he was active. She actually had a crush on one of the boys he killed. He was friends with my uncles. One of my uncles used to bum rides to the beach to go surfing and was riding with Coral before a gas station attendant they knew made him stay at the gas station instead. My mom says the cops really didn't care at the time because it was a poor neighborhood. Apparently they kept saying the boys were runaways rather than actually investigating the disappearances. The Toy Box Killer transcripts come to mind. If you absolutely want to have your day ruined, this has to be one of the most disturbing, creepiest things ever. David Parker Ray would play these tapes for his victims, so they had an idea of what was coming and to also mentally break them. Hear the start of one tape to give you an idea. Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained. Gagged. Probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared, too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal, under the circumstances. For a little while, at least, you need to get your shit together and listen to this tape. It is very relevant to your situation. I'm going to tell you, in detail, why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you and how long you'll be here. I don't know the details of your capture, because this tape is being created July 23, 1993 as a general advisory tape for future female captives. I just read about Fred and Rose West, a married couple in the UK who collectively were among the most prolific serial killers in modern UK history. It is a grim tale of rape and incest and prostitution and brutal murders and dismemberment of family members and random strangers, some of whom they buried in the garden behind their house. It's a fascinating yet horrific story. I just read about Fred and Rose West, a married couple in the UK who collectively were among the most prolific serial killers in modern UK history. It is a grim tale of rape and incest and prostitution and brutal murders and dismemberment of family members and random strangers, some of whom they buried in the garden behind their house. It's a fascinating yet horrific story. There's a podcast called Unheard, the Fred and Rose West tapes by the journalist who covered them at the time, and wrote a book on them. When you hear their backstories, it's more a question of how unfortunate the circumstances were that they ever met, an absolute perfect storm of the most fucked up people imaginable. Also, there was a documentary on ITV Tonight about how Rose had a relationship with Myra Hindley, Moore's murderers, in prison. I just finished Mindhunter the other day, so this question is interesting. It would be the killer of the Atlanta kids. Yeah, they arrested Wayne Williams. But he might not kill all of them. The case was never solved. Terrifying. Ivan Milat, that cunt just came off as a good-intentioned Aussie bloke giving a lift to a foreign hitchhikers which then he literally brutally murdered in a forest. There is so much uninhabited land here in Australia, the population only takes up 5% of the total land. Freaks me the fuck out to think about all the dead bodies that were never found and never will be found. Not sure if it's been said yet, but I'm going with Gary Ridgway, or the Green River Killer. Dude killed between 50 and 70 women, usually teen runaways or sex workers, by picking them up in his car, smooth-talking them, showing them pictures of his son to gain trust, having sex with them and then strangling them with his bare hands and dumping them in the forest near Green River, just outside of Seattle. Normal-looking mid-30s family man who claimed murdering young women was his career and bragged about having the most confirmed kills of any American serial killer. Ted Bundy. There are separate accounts of him transforming himself, noticeably changing in front of a jail official and a relative at a bus station, to the point he smelled and felt different to them. He spoke of the entity within himself, and he was really good at changing his appearance and evading capture. Something freaky about that monster. I just recently learned about Nathaniel Bar Jonah. Easily the most disturbing criminal I've read about. Today's modern-day Albert Fish. Bar Jonah's interest in crime began when he attempted to strangle another child when he was only 7 years old. Eventually the sickness in his mind evolved so far that he would impersonate police officers in order to abduct, sexually harass, or sometimes kill his child victims. He was caught and released by police multiple times and eventually deemed not a credible threat to society. He later moved across the country and began cannibalizing children. It is likely that he fed bits of children to his friends and neighbors during cookouts. Absolutely horrifying case. People will unfortunately be reminded of the other box killers, but the toy box killer takes the cake for me. Had a soundproof trailer in which he would kidnap and torture women in every sense of the word. His body count is unknown, but is suspected to be 50+ victims. What is markedly disturbing about the toy box killer is the audio tape he would play for his victims just prior to torturing and murdering them. You can find the recording/transcript somewhere online. I would scrounge the internet for a link, but I'd appreciate my sanity for another night. The killers of James Bulger. They were both only kids who killed another little kid. The murder was so horrific the police hasn't said what happened in its full. A documentary I saw on it used the powerful phrase rape as an understatement for what happened, and the thought of that happening to a 4-year-old by two 10-year-olds is horrific. Even worse was in an interview as they said they killed him because he looked like Chucky, and after killing him, shoved batteries up his ass to see if he came back to life. Firstly, what kind of messed up parenting creates that? Secondly, F for the poor mothers. Thirdly, does this mean kids who have seen Chucky, God forbid, will kill any young kid with red hair? Murder of a 2-year-old child by two circa 10-year-olds is bad enough. That those two tortured him and sexually molested his body is profoundly disturbing. I've read that there is some evidence Bulger was sobbing as the boys led him away and that almost none of the adults they passed did anything to question what is going on. Almost as disturbing is, if I'm not mistaken, neither of the now young men are in prison. One of them seems to have genuinely reformed, but the other, he has been busted on various charges including possession of child porn. I hope the authorities are keeping him on a short leash. He seems almost destined to molest, maybe murder, again. There's recently been a series in the UK on serial killer Dennis Day Nielsen. A Scottish killer who lived in London, and prowled bars and streets for young men to entice back to his flat. He killed many people, and was caught after a plumber found human bones and a mass of flesh in the drains. Turned out Day was dismembering his victims, and trying to flush the remains. In his previous flat he would burn and bury the remains, but his second flat was top floor of a 3-story building, so resorted to flushing. The police found the remains of 3 men in bin bags and a wardrobe, as well as under a drawer in the bathroom, and a head in a large cooking pot on the stove. One killing which stood out for me was a young guy Dave found outside his property one day who was unwell. He helped the guy get to the hospital for treatment. Days later, the young man went back to thank Dave for saving his life, stayed for a drink, and Dave drugged, strangled, and dismembered him. This reminded me of Jeffrey Dahmer and the lad who escaped his flat to the police, who then delivered him back to Dahmer's flat. People in the world astound me. There will never be peace whilst people like this exist.